These seats aren't for you." That's how it started. The flight attendant's eyes, cold and hard on two little black girls, twins, barely 10. Their dad? Standing tall, holding first-class tickets she wouldn't touch. Fraud, she spat. Threats of removal, humiliation blossoming in the cabin. What Sarah didn't know, what fueled her spite, was that a man owned the damn airline. See, the world loves a twist, right? But this wasn't just about power. Not really. It's about the quiet way those girls held their heads, the trust in their father's eyes. They have no idea how her quiet kindness will change everything. Sarah Jenkins is about to learn a brutal lesson, a lesson served cold. What this flight attendant doesn't know is that the man she's scorning doesn't just have a ticket. He owns the entire airline. The morning sun of a crisp Los Angeles autumn spilled into the sprawling minimalist kitchen of Robert Williams' Bear Mansion. It was a home built of glass, white marble, and success with panoramic views that stretched from the downtown skyline to the distant shimmer of the Pacific. But the real light in the house came from the two small figures currently waging a passionate, giggling war over the last Belgian waffle. "It's mine, Ava. I call dibs," Mia Williams declared, her voice a 10-year-old's approximation of supreme authority. Her beaded braids, identical to her sister's, danced around her face as she made a strategic lunge for the plate. You can't call dibs on a shared breakfast resource. "Dad." Ava appealed to the higher court, her expression one of mock injustice. "Mia is violating breakfast protocol." Robert Williams chuckled, looking up from the tablet where he was reviewing preliminary quarterly reports for his portfolio of companies. At 42, he possessed a quiet intensity, a stillness that often made people underestimate him. He was a man who had built an empire from the ground up, starting with a small tech logistics firm and expanding into hospitality, real estate, and most recently, and most passionately, aviation. His face, which could look severe in a boardroom, was softened now by fatherhood. "Breakfast protocol dictates that the final waffle is split by a neutral party," he said, his voice a warm baritone. He rose, his 6'2" frame, easily navigating the kitchen island. With the precision of a surgeon, he divided the waffle, drizzled it with an equal measure of maple syrup, and presented the two halves to his daughters. A diplomatic resolution. They beamed, their brief conflict forgotten. This was their world, a world of fairness, logic, and unconditional love, all curated by their father. They had lost their mother to cancer 4 years prior, a wound that Robert still felt keenly every day. In the wake of that loss, he had thrown himself into being the best father he could be, a constant, reassuring presence in their lives. He was determined to build a world for them where they felt safe, cherished, and limitless. Today was a special day. It was the twins' 10th birthday, and he was taking them on a trip to New York City. It wasn't just any trip. They were flying on Starlight Airlines, the crown jewel of his recent acquisitions, and they were flying first class. For Ava, the budding engineer, the thrill was the plane itself, an Airbus A380, the gentle giant of the skies. For Mia, the aspiring artist, it was the magic of New York, a city she'd only seen in movies. "Remember the rules for today, girls," Robert said as they finished their breakfast. "Stay close in the airport, be polite to everyone, and don't tell anyone you own the plane." They recited in unison, rolling their eyes with the practiced exasperation of children who have heard a rule many times. Robert had started Starlight Airlines not just as a business venture, but as a passion project. He was a licensed pilot himself, and believed that the magic had gone out of air travel. He wanted to build an airline that prioritized customer experience that made flying feel like a luxury again for everyone. He poured millions into cabin design, staff training, and service protocols. He often flew his own routes unannounced, sitting in coach or business to observe the operations firsthand. He wanted his employees to be the best because they were treated the best, not because they were afraid of the boss. Today, however, was different. It was a celebration. He wanted to share the best of what he had built with his daughters. Their journey to LAX was smooth. A discreet black car service dropped them at a private entrance for first-class passengers. The check-in was seamless, the staff addressing him as Mr. Williams with professional deference, none of them knowing he was the ultimate Mr. Williams. The girls, dressed in matching, comfortable but stylish travel outfits their father had picked out, looked at everything with wide-eyed wonder. The first-class lounge was an oasis of calm. Ava immediately found a window overlooking the tarmac, pointing out the different aircraft models to her sister. Mia pulled out her sketchbook, already trying to capture the curve of an airplane's wing. Robert watched them, a feeling of profound contentment washing over him. He was giving them a glimpse of the world he had built, a world he hoped they would one day helped to lead. He had shielded them from the harsh realities that often lay just beyond the pristine glass walls of their life, from the casual cruelties and ingrained prejudices that he, as a black man in America, knew all too well. He had hoped, perhaps naively, that by the time they were old enough to understand it, the world would be a better place. He had no idea that in less than an hour, that carefully constructed shield was about to be shattered by the very person who was paid to represent the excellence and hospitality of his own company. As they announced boarding for Flight 277 to JFK, the girls packed up their things, their excitement palpable. "Ready to fly, my little stars?" Robert asked, taking each of them by the hand. "Ready, Dad?" they squealed. They walked down the jet bridge, Robert's heart swelling with pride. He watched his daughters step across the threshold of the plane, their faces lit with anticipation. They were stepping into what should have been a magical experience, a birthday memory to cherish forever. But waiting for them just inside the door with a clipboard in hand and a sour, assessing look on her face was a flight attendant named Sarah Jenkins. And Sarah had already made up her mind about the kind of people she thought they were. Sarah Jenkins was having a bad day, which for her was not an unusual state of affairs. At 52, she had been a flight attendant for nearly 3 decades, and the initial glamour of the job had long since faded, leaving behind a residue of resentment. She had seen the industry change from what she considered a golden era of respected professionals to a modern world of budget cuts, unruly passengers, and in her opinion, a lowering of standards. She prided herself on being old school, which in her mind meant maintaining a rigid, unyielding authority. To her colleagues, it meant she was bitter, inflexible, and often unnecessarily confrontational. She scanned the manifest on her tablet. The first-class cabin was nearly full. A tech CEO, a minor celebrity, a few wealthy couples. Then she saw the names: Williams, Robert, Williams, Ava, Williams, Mia. Seats 2A, 2B, and 2C. She didn't think anything of it until she looked up from her tablet and saw them. A black man and his 2 young daughters. They didn't fit her mental image of the first-class clientele of Starlight Airlines, a brand she felt a misplaced sense of ownership over. She saw a man who was, to her eyes, dressed just a little too flashy in his designer travel wear, and 2 little girls whose excited energy struck her as disruptive. Her mind, a storehouse of ugly, unexamined biases, began to churn. Lottery winner, she thought. Or maybe a rapper. Got more money than class. Robert, holding his daughter's hands, approached her with a warm, friendly smile. "Good morning. We're in 2A, B, and C." Sarah didn't smile back. Her eyes flickered from his face to the girls, then down to their boarding passes, which he held out. She made no move to take them. Instead, she put a hand up, physically barring their path into the first-class cabin. "I need to see those, please," she said, her voice clipped and cool. Robert's smile faltered slightly, but he maintained his polite demeanor. He held the boarding passes closer for her to inspect. Her eyes scanned them, her lips tightening into a thin, disapproving line. "There might be a mistake," she said, looking not at him, but over his shoulder, as if searching for a more legitimate passenger. "This is the first-class cabin." The implication was as clear as it was ugly. Robert felt a familiar, weary tightening in his chest. He had encountered this 100 times in his life, the subtle and not so subtle questioning of his presence in spaces of privilege. He had just never expected it here in his own house, so to speak. For the sake of his daughters, who were now looking up at him with confusion, he kept his voice even. "Yes, I'm aware. Our seats are just there." He pointed towards the spacious pods, visible just beyond her. Sarah shook her head slowly, a smirk playing on her lips. "I think you'll find that economy seating is further down the aircraft. Perhaps you got turned around on the jet bridge." The condescension was thick enough to taste. Ava and Mia shuffled closer to their father. The magic of the moment was draining away, replaced by a growing sense of unease. "There's no mistake," Robert said, his voice a little firmer now. "These are our seats. Please, could you let us pass? My daughters are very excited." "I'm sure they are," Sarah replied, her tone suggesting their excitement was an annoyance. She finally took the boarding passes from his hand, holding them by the very corner as if they were contaminated. She stared at them for a theatrically long time. "These tickets are often acquired fraudulently. I'll need to see the credit card used for the purchase and a matching ID. This was a gross violation of protocol. Once a passenger had a valid boarding pass, such checks were unheard of at the cabin door. Robert knew it. Several other first-class passengers who were now settling into their seats knew it too. A man in seat 3D, a seasoned business traveler named Mark, lowered his newspaper slightly, his brow furrowed in disapproval at the flight attendant's behavior. Robert's patience was wearing thin, but he refused to create a scene that would frighten his children. He calmly reached into his travel wallet and produced his driver's license and the Starlight Airlines exclusive Centurion card he had used for the booking, a sleek black metal card issued only to the airline's most valued clients. He had designed the program himself. Sarah took them, her eyes widening almost imperceptibly at the sight of the elite card, before her expression hardened again, as if she was determined to find fault. She compared the name on the card and ID to the boarding passes. They matched perfectly. Robert Williams. For a moment, it seemed she would have to concede. She was cornered by the facts, but prejudice is rarely logical. She handed the cards back, her movements jerky with frustration. "Even so," she said, her voice low and conspiratorial, as if she were doing him a favor. "It's just not going to work." "What exactly is not going to work?" Robert asked, his voice now laced with an icy calm that should have served as a warning. "The other first-class passengers, they've paid a lot of money for a quiet, premium experience," she said, gesturing vaguely at the cabin. "Two excitable children in the cabin is a disruption. It's not fair to them." This was the moment the situation turned from a veiled accusation to an open act of discrimination. She was no longer questioning his finances, but his family's right to exist in this space. Ava and Mia, though young, understood the sting of rejection. Mia's eyes began to well up with tears, and she hid her face in her father's coat. Ava, ever the protector, glared at Sarah with a ferocity that was a miniature echo of her father's. "My children," Robert said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more commanding than a shout, "are better behaved than most of the adults I know. They are ticketed passengers and they have every right to be here. Now, for the last time, please step aside and allow us to take our seats." Sarah squared her shoulders, misinterpreting his controlled anger as a confirmation of her stereotype of him as an aggressive man. She felt a surge of self-righteousness. She was the guardian of this cabin's sanctity. "Sir, if you continue to take this tone with me, I will have you removed from the aircraft," she threatened, her voice rising to attract the attention of her colleagues. "We have a zero-tolerance policy for aggressive passengers." It was a masterful, malicious twist. She was painting him as the aggressor, herself as the victim. The father protecting his children from blatant racism was being reframed as a threat. Robert stood his ground, a silent pillar of defiance. He looked past Sarah down the aisle of the cabin he owned, at the passengers who were now openly staring, a mixture of discomfort, pity, and annoyance on their faces. He looked down at his crying daughter and his defiant one. And in that moment, he knew that his policy of quiet observation was over. The shield he had built for his girls had been breached, and he was about to show Sarah Jenkins and everyone else on Starlight Flight 277 the true meaning of power. In seat 4F, nestled by the window, sat a young woman named Chloe Sterling. To the casual observer, she was just another millennial engrossed in her phone. With her oversized glasses and faded band t-shirt, she didn't fit the typical first-class mold any more than the Williams family did in Sarah's eyes. But Chloe was one of the most influential travel vloggers in the world. Her channel, Nomad Chloe, had millions of subscribers, and her word could make or break a hotel, a restaurant, or even an airline. She had been offered this upgraded flight by Starlight's PR team, hoping for a glowing review. Initially, Chloe had been paying little attention to the conflict at the door, assuming it was a simple ticketing issue, but the flight attendant's raised voice, sharp with a distinct, ugly undertone, had cut through the cabin's quiet hum. Chloe looked up, and her vlogger instincts immediately kicked in. She saw the flight attendant's rigid posture, the father's strained but controlled expression, and the two beautiful little girls, one crying silently, the other looking on with a fierce, wounded pride. This was more than a ticketing issue. This was a story. With a practiced, subtle movement, she propped her phone up against the cabin wall, angled perfectly towards the doorway. She hit the record button. The lens was unobtrusive, just another black rectangle in a cabin full of them. But it was capturing everything. Sarah's sneering condescension, Robert's quiet dignity, and every word of the escalating confrontation. The man in 3D, Mark, the business traveler, finally had enough. He was a man in his late 60s, with a shock of white hair and a face that spoke of decades of high-stakes negotiations. He recognized injustice when he saw it. "For goodness sake, Sarah," he said, his voice a low rumble of authority. "The man has valid boarding passes. Let him and his children sit down. You're making a scene." Sarah shot him a venomous look. She knew Mark. He was a frequent flyer on this route, a Diamond tier member. But in her current state of self-righteous fury, his status meant nothing. He was interfering. "Sir, with all due respect, this is a crew matter. Please remain uninvolved," she snapped, before turning her attention back to Robert. The intervention had only served to harden her resolve. She felt her authority was being challenged on all fronts, and she was determined to win. "That's it," she declared, her voice now loud and theatrical for all to hear. "I've had it with your hostility. You are a security risk. I am calling the captain." She reached for the intercom phone on the wall, her movements sharp and triumphant. She was escalating the situation to the highest level, confident that the captain would back his crew member and have this disruptive family escorted off the plane. She envisioned the security team marching on board, the walk of shame they would endure back up the jet bridge. It would be a validation of her judgment. Robert watched her, his face an unreadable mask. He didn't try to stop her. He didn't argue. He simply gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He had given her every chance to walk back from the precipice. He had tried to de-escalate, to reason, to appeal to her professionalism, but she had chosen this path. She had chosen to double down on her bigotry and abuse of power. Ava, no longer glaring, now looked scared. She tugged on her father's hand. "Daddy, are we in trouble? I don't want to go to jail." Robert knelt, pulling both his daughters into a hug, shielding them from Sarah's poisonous glare. "No, baby. Not even close," he whispered, his voice for them alone, full of a reassurance he didn't entirely feel. His heart ached for their stolen innocence. "We are not in trouble. That woman is. She just doesn't know it yet. Just stand here with me and be brave for one more minute. Can you do that?" Both girls nodded against his chest, drawing strength from his embrace. Sarah spoke into the intercom, her voice laced with manufactured panic. "Captain, this is Sora in the first-class cabin. I have a situation here. A passenger is being aggressive and refusing to comply with crew instructions. He and his family are not ticketed for this cabin. I believe security is required." A moment of silence passed. The entire cabin was now watching, a captive audience to a drama they never signed up for. Chloe Sterling's phone continued to record the digital eye, an impartial witness to the unfolding injustice. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, calm and professional. "Understood, Sarah. Stay where you are. I'm sending someone to assess the situation." Sarah hung up the phone with a satisfied smirk. She crossed her arms, positioning herself between the Williams family and the seats, a self-appointed gatekeeper. She looked at Robert with an expression of pure, unadulterated triumph. "They'll be here any second," she said, savoring her perceived victory. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before trying to force your way into a place you don't belong." Robert finally met her gaze. The mask of calm patience fell away, not to be replaced by anger, but by something far more chilling. Pity. "You're right," Robert said, his voice quiet and even. "Someone will be here any second." He straightened up, his full height seeming to diminish her. He reached into his pocket, not for a wallet or an ID, but for his personal cell phone. With a few swift taps, he selected a single name from his contacts and pressed the call button. He didn't even put the phone to his ear, simply holding it in his hand as it connected. The call was answered on the first ring, and Robert Williams said only 5 words. "Daniel, we have a problem." The name Daniel meant nothing to Sarah Jenkins. It meant nothing to the other passengers. It was just a name. She watched Robert make his call with a dismissive sneer. "Who's he calling?" she thought contemptuously. "His lawyer?" It's too late for that. She was secure in her belief that the chain of command was on her side. The captain, the ground crew, security. They would all back the word of a 30-year veteran flight attendant over a passenger she had successfully painted as belligerent. Less than a minute passed. To Sarah, it felt like a glorious, triumphant 60 seconds. To Robert, it was a moment of quiet, grim necessity. He hated what he was about to do, not for Sarah's sake, but because it meant revealing his hand, breaking his own rule of anonymity. But the well-being of his daughters trumped everything else. The cabin door, which had been closed in preparation for departure, swung open again. But it wasn't airport security that stepped on board. It was a man in a sharply tailored suit, his face pale and etched with worry. He was Daniel Peterson, the Chief Operating Officer of Starlight Airlines. Flanking him was the flight's captain, a distinguished man with silvering temples named Captain Miller. The moment Daniel Peterson saw Robert Williams standing by the galley, his expression shifted from anxiety to profound difference. "Mr. Williams," Daniel said, his voice tight with stress as he hurried down the aisle. "Sir, I came as soon as I got your call. What's happened?" Sarah's smug expression froze on her face. Her brain struggled to process the scene. The COO of the entire airline was on her plane, addressing the man she had just tried to eject, and he was calling him Sir. It didn't compute. Captain Miller, who had been told only that there was a special situation in first class, was equally stunned. He recognized Robert Williams instantly from the company's highest-level corporate briefings. He was the almost mythical owner of the airline, a man whose identity was a closely guarded secret from the rank-and-file employees. "Mr. Williams," the captain said, his own voice now laced with a deep concern that bordered on alarm. "Is there a problem with my crew?" Robert didn't answer immediately. He kept his eyes locked on Sarah. He wanted her to understand the full magnitude of her actions, to experience the slow, dawning horror of her mistake. Sarah's face had gone from smug to confused to utterly ashen. The blood drained from her cheeks. The name plate on the COO's lapel read Daniel Peterson. The name Robert had spoken into the phone. "Mr. Williams, sir." The pieces began to click into place with the sickening finality of a coffin lid closing. She looked at Robert, truly looked at him for the first time. Not as a stereotype, but as a man. She saw the impeccable tailoring of his suit, the quiet authority in his stance, the sheer, unadulterated power that radiated from him, a power she had completely, catastrophically misread. "You," she whispered, her voice barely a croak. He's the man who signs your paycheck, Sarah," Captain Miller finished for her, his voice grim. He now understood the nature of the passenger aggression she had reported, and a cold fury began to build within him. He was a pilot who took immense pride in his airline and his crew. Her behavior was a stain on all of it. Daniel Peterson turned to Sarah, his face a mask of controlled rage. "What did you do?" he demanded. Sarah was speechless. Her mind was a whirlwind of denial and panic. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a prank, a bizarre, elaborate test. But the terrified look on the captain's face and the COO's furious glare told her it was all horrifyingly real. I was just following procedure," she stammered, falling back on the last refuge of a coward. "They're tickets," I thought. They seemed disruptive. Daniel shot back, his voice rising. "Or they didn't fit your idea of a first-class passenger. We have the most advanced booking and security system in the industry. These tickets were verified 6 times before this family ever set foot on this aircraft. You were not following procedure. You were engaging in harassment. You were discriminating against a man and his 2 10-year-old daughters on their birthday. The mention of their birthday was like a physical blow to the watching passengers. The sympathy in the cabin, already firmly with the family, curdled into outright hostility towards Sarah. Mark, the businessman in 3D, shook his head in disgust. In 4F, Chloe Sterling's phone was still recording, capturing the raw, stunning climax of the confrontation. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was a bombshell. Robert finally spoke, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of ultimate authority. He addressed Daniel and the captain, but his words were meant for Sarah. For 10 minutes he began, "This employee has refused my children their seats. She accused me of fraud. She threatened me with security. She tried to humiliate my family in front of an entire cabin, because she didn't like the color of our skin. He paused, letting the words hang in the silent cabin. She did this on my plane, he continued. The words, my plane landing with the force of a gavel, in my company, wearing my uniform. He then looked down at his daughters who were watching the scene unfold with wide, uncomprehending eyes. He knelt before them once more. Ava, Maya, he said gently, turning their faces away from the now crumbling flight attendant. Let's go find our seats. The problem is being taken care of. He took their hands and led them past the frozen form of Sarah Jenkins. As they passed, he stopped for a fraction of a second and looked directly at her. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes conveyed everything. Her career at Starlight Airlines, and likely in the entire aviation industry, was over. As he settled his daughters into their spacious first-class pods, the auras of which now seemed tainted by the preceding ugliness, he heard Daniel Peterson's voice, low and final, addressed to Sarah. Give Captain Miller your credentials. A security escort will meet you at the gate. You are suspended. Effective immediately. Pending termination. Get off this aircraft now. The reign of Sarah Jenkins, the self-appointed gatekeeper of the skies, had ended not with a bang, but with the quiet, devastating click of a door opening for the man who owned the world she thought she controlled. The moment Sarah Jenkins, stripped of her wings and her dignity, was escorted off the plane. A strange quiet fell over the first-class cabin. It was the awkward silence that follows a public, messy spectacle. Captain Miller's voice came over the intercom, apologizing to all passengers for the unacceptable service failure and the resulting departure delay. The cabin crew, their faces a mixture of shock and embarrassment, moved through the aisles, offering champagne and heartfelt apologies. One attendant, a kind-faced woman named Maria, knelt by Ava and Mia's seats. On behalf of all of us, she said softly, I am so sorry for what you experienced. That was not Starlight. That was not who we are. Robert appreciated her sincerity, but the damage was done. The magic of the trip was irrevocably tarnished. He could see it in his daughter's eyes. Their excitement had been replaced by a quiet, somber watchfulness. They were learning a hard lesson about the world today, a lesson he had desperately tried to shield them from. As the A380 finally pushed back from the gate and began its powerful rumbling journey into the sky, another storm was brewing on the ground. In Seat 4F, Chloe Sterling had stopped recording. She had over 20 minutes of high-definition footage of the entire incident. From Sarah's first condescending words to her final ignominious exit, she knew this was the most powerful piece of content she had ever captured. This wasn't just a travel review. It was a raw, undeniable document of modern-day racism. Using the plane's high-speed Wi-Fi, a service Robert had insisted be the best in the industry, she began to work. She wasn't a sensationalist. She was a storyteller. She edited the footage down to a tight, compelling 10-minute video. She didn't add dramatic music or flashy graphics. She didn't need to. The raw audio and video were damning enough. She added simple, factual subtitles and a brief text introduction. This happened today on Starlight Airlines Flight 277. The family was ticketed in first class. The flight attendant decided they didn't belong there. What she didn't know will shock you. She wrote a brief, powerful description, tagged Starlight Airlines, and uploaded it to her YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter accounts. Then, with a deep breath, she hit publish. By the time Flight 2711 was leveling off at its cruising altitude of 35,000 FT, the video was an inferno. The internet moves at the speed of outrage, and the video of Sarah Jenkins was pure fuel. It was viewed 1 million times in the first hour, 2 million the next. The hashtags, Nortos, Starlight Shame, Lost Flying While Black, and Also Sarah the Gatekeeper began trending globally. The comment section was a torrent of fury. People from all walks of life expressed their disgust. Other airline employees chimed in, condemning Sarah's actions and sharing their own stories of dealing with prejudiced colleagues. The story was picked up by small blogs, then major news outlets. The Daily Mail, CNN, the New York Times, they all ran the story, embedding Chloe's video. The narrative was electrifyingly clear and potent. A racist flight attendant had tried to humiliate a black family, only to discover the father was the billionaire owner of the airline. It was a story of hubris and karma, so perfect it seemed scripted. On the ground, Starlight Airlines headquarters was in full-blown crisis mode. Daniel Peterson's phone was vibrating off his desk. The PR department was being bombarded with requests for comment. The company's stock, which had been on a steady rise since Robert's acquisition, began to tremble as the markets caught wind of the story. Daniel, under direct orders from Robert mid-flight, initiated a full-scale internal investigation. He pulled Sarah Jenkins' employee file. It was a revelation. Over the past 5 years, Sarah had accumulated a dozen informal passenger complaints for rudeness and an abrasive attitude. 3 of those complaints were from minority passengers who had described her behavior as discriminatory. In each case, a mid-level HR manager had conducted a cursory interview, issued a minor slap on the wrist, and filed the complaint away. No pattern was identified. No serious action was ever taken. The system hadn't just failed today. It had been failing for years. The manager, who had repeatedly dismissed the complaints, was summarily suspended alongside Sarah. Robert, disconnected from the burgeoning chaos on the ground, focused on his daughters. He tried to salvage their birthday. He had the crew bring them a special cake, let them visit the cockpit once the plane was safely at cruising altitude, and pointed out the constellations on the entertainment system star map. They smiled and thanked him, but the shadow remained. During a quiet moment as the girls watched a movie, Robert looked out the window at the endless expanse of blue. He felt a profound sense of failure. He had built this airline to be a symbol of excellence, a place where every passenger felt valued. Yet he had allowed a culture to fester right under his nose where a cancer like Sarah Jenkins could thrive. He had created a gilded cage for his daughters. But the real world, with all its ugliness, had found a way in. The viral video, the stock price, the PR nightmare. None of that mattered to him in that moment. What mattered were the 2 little girls in the seats next to him. The joy that had been stolen from their eyes was a debt he intended to collect on. When Flight 277 touched down at JFK in New York, they were met on the jet bridge, not by security, but by a hand-picked team of Starlight's most senior New York-based executives. They were there to personally escort the Williams family and ensure their transit through the airport was seamless. But as they walked through the terminal, Robert saw it everywhere. People were looking at them, pointing, whispering. They were no longer an anonymous family. They were the family from the video. His private battle for his children's dignity had become a global spectacle. The hard karma for Sarah Jenkins had been delivered swiftly, but Robert knew the real work of fixing his company and healing his family had only just begun. The days that followed were a whirlwind of media attention and corporate restructuring. Robert Williams, who had always fiercely guarded his privacy, found himself and his children at the center of a national conversation about race and privilege. He could have retreated back into the sanctuary of his wealth, but he chose to face it head-on. He released a single powerful public statement. He did not mention Sarah Jenkins by name. He did not revel in her downfall. Instead, he spoke of his deep personal and professional failure. The incident on Flight 277 was not the failure of a single employee, he wrote. It was a failure of our corporate culture, and for that I take full responsibility. I founded Starlight Airlines with the dream of bringing hospitality and respect back to the skies. It is clear I have much work to do to make that dream a reality for all our passengers. He announced an immediate top-to-bottom review of all HR policies and employee training to be overseen by an independent diversity, equity, and inclusion DEI firm. He pledged $5 million from his personal fortune to create a new foundation, the AIza and Maya Project, dedicated to supporting non-profits that empower and educate youth in underserved communities. He turned a moment of personal pain into a catalyst for systemic change. The public response was overwhelmingly positive. His humility and swift, decisive action were praised. Starlight's shaky stock price stabilized and began to climb once more, this time buoyed by a newfound public trust in its owner. But for Sarah Jenkins, the fallout was absolute. The hard karma was not a single event. It was a slow, crushing cascade. Her termination from Starlight Airlines was swift and final. The flight attendants' union, after reviewing the undeniable video evidence and her spotty record, refused to challenge the dismissal. She was disgraced. She soon discovered that the Internet's memory is long and its judgment unforgiving. Chloe Sterling's video had been viewed over 100 million times across all platforms. Sarah's name and face were inextricably linked with a very public act of racism. She tried to apply for positions at other major airlines, but her name was now toxic. No one would touch her. The career she had dedicated her life to, the identity she had wrapped herself in, was gone. She was forced to sell her modest suburban condo to cover her legal fees and living expenses. She moved into a small, cramped apartment. The news channels she once watched with a sense of detachment now seemed to mock her, occasionally replaying the clip of her own downfall when discussing corporate accountability. Friends she had known for decades slowly distanced themselves, embarrassed to be associated with her. She was isolated, unemployable, and haunted by the consequences of a prejudice she had never bothered to confront until it destroyed her. One evening about 6 months after the incident, Sarah was channel surfing in her lonely apartment. She stopped on a local news channel. They were doing a follow-up story on Starlight Airlines. The segment featured an interview with Chloe Sterling, the vlogger from the flight, who was now working with the airline as a paid consultant for their new customer experience program. Then the reporter introduced the new head of Starlight's DEI initiatives. It was a poised, brilliant black woman who spoke passionately about creating a culture of radical empathy. At the end of the segment, she was shown walking through a newly refurbished training center with the airline's owner. The camera panned to Robert Williams. He was walking hand in hand with his daughters, Ava and Mia, showing them a mural that had been painted on the wall of the new center. It was a beautiful, vibrant piece of art, depicting people of all races looking up at a starry sky. The news anchor mentioned that the training center had been dedicated that day and named the Williams Family Center for excellence and inclusion. Ava and Mia were laughing, pointing at the mural. The joy that had been stolen from them on that flight had returned, brighter and stronger. They looked happy, safe, and loved. They were standing in a building dedicated to ensuring no one would ever suffer the humiliation they had. A building that existed because of what Sarah had done. Sarah Jenkins stared at the screen, at the smiling faces of the family she had tried to break. She saw no anger or vengeance in Robert Williams' face, only purpose. She saw no trauma in the girl's eyes, only resilience. They had moved on, not just by forgetting, but by building something better from the wreckage she had created. She, on the other hand, was trapped in the past. a ghost in her own life. The hard karma wasn't just losing her job or her reputation. It was the crushing eternal knowledge that her act of petty hatred had inadvertently become the fertile ground from which a legacy of positive change, a legacy bearing the names of the very children she had scorned, would grow. She had tried to slam a door in their faces, and in doing so, had opened a gateway to a better world for everyone but herself. That was her true and lasting punishment. 5 years is a lifetime in the world of a child. For Ava and Mia Williams, now poised on the cusp of 16, the incident on Flight 277 was no longer a raw open wound, but a foundational scar that had shaped the very architecture of their beings. The world had moved on. The viral hashtags had faded, but the memory lived within them, a quiet, constant hum beneath the surface of their lives. Mia found her voice not in words but in charcoal and oil paints. Her spacious art studio, a birthday gift from her father that overlooked the Pacific, was a gallery of ghosts. She never painted the scene on the airplane directly, but its essence was in everything she created. She painted portraits of people whose eyes held stories of being overlooked. She created vast, unsettling canvases of empty chairs in opulent settings, conveying a profound sense of displacement. Her most famous piece, which had won a prestigious Youth Art Award, was titled Gatekeeper. It depicted a stark white door, slightly ajar, with a sliver of brilliant warm light visible. Blocking the door was a single, gnarled, shadowy hand. Critics had lauded its minimalist power. Only Mia and her family knew the precise, ugly truth it represented. The trauma had not broken her. It had focused her, turning her artistic talent into a tool for sharp, empathetic commentary. Ava, on the other hand, had claimed her voice with words, sharp, analytical, and fiery. The girl who had glared defiantly at Sarah Jenkins had grown into a formidable debater and youth activist. The incident had ignited in her a burning need to understand and dismantle the systems that allowed such injustices to occur. She devoured books on law, sociology, and critical race theory. She interned at the ACLU. Her father would often watch her during debate tournaments, a lump of pride and sorrow in his throat. He saw a brilliant legal mind in the making, a fierce advocate for the underdog. But he also knew her passion was forged in the fire of a humiliation she should never have experienced. He had wanted to give his daughters the world. Instead, the world had given them a cause. Robert Williams himself had been transformed. The Ava and Mia project had become the central focus of his life, eclipsing even his passion for the airline. He had learned that running a company and fostering a true culture of respect were two vastly different things. He was more hands-on than ever, not just in boardrooms, but in the community centers, schools and youth shelters his foundation now supported across the country. Starlight Airlines was a model of corporate turnaround. The Williams Family Center for Excellence and Inclusion was not just a name on a building. It was the heart of the company, where every single employee, from baggage handler to pilot, underwent rigorous and continuous training in empathy, de-escalation, and cultural competency. The changes were real. Passenger satisfaction scores were the highest in the industry, and Starlight was consistently voted the best airline for family travel. It was a success, but every accolade felt like a pedal laid on the grave of his daughter's stolen innocence. One crisp afternoon in New York, where the family was visiting for a foundation gala, Robert was reviewing a report. It detailed the success of a downtown Manhattan shelter and soup kitchen that the Ava and Mia project had saved from bankruptcy a few years prior. The report mentioned the dedication of their long-term volunteers. An idea sparked in his mind. "Girls," he said later that day, finding them in their hotel suite. "Change of plans for this afternoon. Cancel the shopping. I want to show you something." He took them to the shelter. It was in a gritty, unassuming part of the city, a world away from the 5-star luxury they had just left. The smell of disinfectant and simmering soup hung in the air. Robert wanted them to see the tangible good that had come from their pain, to connect the abstract idea of their foundation with the real lives it touched. As they toured the facility, guided by the grateful director, Robert saw his daughters' faces. Mia looked at the tired faces of the people waiting in line for a meal with an artist's profound sympathy. Ava observed the logistics of the operation, her mind already working on how to make it more efficient. And then Robert saw her. She was in the kitchen behind the steam of the industrial soup pots. She was older, thinner, her hair now completely grey and pulled back in a severe bun. The sharp, bitter lines on her face had been replaced by the deeper, more weary lines of hardship. She wore a simple apron stained with tomato sauce. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her eyes downcast, focused entirely on the task of ladling soup into bowls. It was Sarah Jenkins. Robert froze, his heart pounding. He instinctively put a protective arm in front of his daughters, shielding them from the sight. They hadn't noticed her. He watched her for a long moment, a storm of emotions wearing within him. He saw the woman who had tried to humiliate his family. But he also saw a woman who was now serving the homeless in a shelter funded by the very children she had wronged. He saw a woman who had lost everything and was now spending her days performing an act of anonymous, thankless penance. The director, noticing Robert's gaze, whispered, "That's Sarah. She's one of our most reliable volunteers. Been here for almost 3 years, never misses a day. A very quiet woman. Says she's just trying to pay a debt." Sarah looked up for a second to grab another bowl, and her eyes swept across the room. For a fraction of a second, her gaze met Robert's. There was no flicker of malice or resentment. There was only a sudden deer in the headlights terror, followed by an immediate, profound shame. She dropped her gaze back to the soup pot, her shoulders hunching as if bracing for a blow. Robert felt no anger, no desire for revenge. He only felt the final quiet closing of a circle. Her punishment was not just the loss of her career or her public disgrace. It was this, a life of quiet servitude, forever in the shadow of the good she had inadvertently created, a constant living reminder of her failure. He gently steered his daughters in the other direction. "Let's go," he said softly. "We've seen enough." They left the shelter, the girls unaware that they had just been in the same room as the ghost of Flight 277. Robert didn't tell them. He knew that their healing was about moving forward, not looking back. Sarah Jenkins was no longer a monster in their past, but a quiet lesson in the complex, unexpected, and ultimately complete arc of karma. The story of the Williams family and Sarah Jenkins did not truly end when the video went viral, nor when a job was lost or a foundation was created. It ended in the quiet, unwitnessed moments that followed years later, echoing in the choices and purposes of those it touched. The legacy of that day was not one of simple revenge, but of profound and divergent transformations. For Sarah Jenkins, her act of prejudice led to a life she never envisioned, one of quiet atonement, stripped of pride and status, defined by service to those she once would have overlooked. Her karma was not a sudden crash, but a long, humbling descent into a life of forced humility, where her only path to a shred of self-worth was to contribute to the legacy of the family she tried to tear down. It was a silent, personal, and complete reckoning. For the Williams family, The legacy was one of resilience turned into purpose. Robert learned that protecting his children didn't mean shielding them from the world's ugliness, but giving them the tools to confront and change it. He steered his immense resources and influence to build a more just world, not out of anger, but out of a father's fierce, transformative love. And for Ava and Mia, the scar of that day became a road map. They are the living embodiment of the story's true moral. They are growing into young women who will forever carry the knowledge that privilege is fragile, that dignity is non-negotiable, and that the most powerful response to hate is not to mirror its ugliness, but to build a beautiful, unbreakable, and inclusive world in its place. Their flight to New York began with an act of baseless discrimination, but their journey through life is now defined by the purpose they found in its wake. A journey that will, without a doubt, lift the world far higher than any airplane ever